Back on One, pleased to welcome in a sideline reporter and host for Fox Sports and the Big Ten Network. Previously, Yankees beat reporter for ESPN. It's Coley Harvey. Coley, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's good to see you again, Emmanuel. Good to be with you guys one more time.
Coley, it's been a wild week in sports and the world as a whole. Your initial reaction when the Bucks news came down?
Proud, to be quite honest. I was happy to see that athletes are beginning to take a little bit more of a stance on some of what we're witnessing in our country right now. One thing I actually have been trying to remind myself and kind of want to remind other people too is it wasn't just the Bucks who really started this. I think if we're looking at just this past week, I think it actually started with the Detroit Lions the day before deciding, we're walking out of practice. We're not going to practice today, but we're going to stand in our parking lot and we're going to talk amongst ourselves, and we're going to have these dialogues, and we're going to show you some of the things that we want to see come out of this week. And I think when that happens, when you have an entire team that pauses that way, I think that kind of gives some of these other leagues and teams and athletes a chance to say, okay, maybe we can respond in some type of way as well. That's not to take anything away from the Milwaukee Bucks at all. That's just also to remind that the Detroit Lions were among those teams that were kind of at the front line of doing this activism this week. But I was proud as someone who's in sports and someone who gets to know the athletes that we see and cover on a daily basis, to get to know them well and to see that it wasn't just one segment of the population of the Bucks team. It wasn't two or three players. It was the entire team. And then to see that trickle throughout the rest of the NBA and then trickle into baseball and hockey even, where you started seeing teams wanting to take stances. I think that was very important. And again, my initial reaction was pride.
Coley, thanks again so much for doing this. And how important do you think it is that athletes use their platforms and we see more of a call for change in terms of social justice from these leagues, whether it be Major League Baseball, the NFL, NBA? How powerful do you think these statements can be when they come from athletes like this?
Incredibly powerful. And in large case, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. When you look at a lot of the leagues, and really baseball aside, but when you look at the NBA and you look at the NFL, the vast majority of players, when we're talking about these specific incidences and these specific events, the vast majority of players in those leagues are African-American. And in baseball, it's 7.8% of the league, so a very small number, but still there are some of the most popular and the biggest names in the game of baseball are Black. So absolutely, the reach is tremendous in these circumstances, in these situations. And so when those athletes have a chance to say, I'm going to take a stance, and whether it is a work stoppage that gets threatened, or if it's some other form of protest, if it's taking a knee, obviously we've seen how controversial, amazingly, it's still amazing to me even to this day, 4 years later, just the controversy that became. We know some of the reasons why and some of the factors at play that made it into a controversy when it wasn't, but that's kind of beside the point. The real impetus is that when you see people who have that type of cachet and that type of status act, they serve in some ways as role models, and they go on to prove that that their voices matter. And for certain segments of the population who don't really see their voices used in that kind of way on the mainstream on a day-to-day, that is important. That's hugely important. And even as I'm thinking through this answer right now, I'm thinking about kind of the late breaking news that we had last night, and hearing, at least as we're recording this, the news that Chadwick Boseman had passed away. And, can't lie, that hit me really hard, because he was not just an actor who I enjoyed watching, not just an actor who was in Black Panther and all these amazing movies, but he was an actor who was giving voice and identity to a segment of the population that doesn't always get their stories told in such a positive and glorifying light. And so to have someone who is telling the story of Jackie Robinson, told the story of Thurgood Marshall, played Floyd Little in The Express, which was really about Ernie Davis, but still a pioneering football player at Syracuse, to be Black Panther, a true Black superhero. I mean, it goes without saying, just that representation alone certainly allows people like myself and particularly kids, younger kids, to see that they can have positive influences in the society at large. So to answer your question, the voice that athletes have and can have in these moments is tremendous. And I think we're certainly seeing them using it for good. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these players have been in many of these situations. I, even very recently, have been in some of these situations and had some of these encounters, whether it's law enforcement or otherwise. And so it's a sense of empathy when they take a stance and they share their stories that I think the rest of us certainly could stand to learn.
Coley, you mentioned some of the disconnect, and the athletes have done a great job of making this conversation mainstream over the last several years. What's the most common misunderstanding maybe you see regarding racial injustice and social movements that you think people often overlook?
It kind of takes me back to a conversation I had a few days ago with actually some coworkers who I work with in my college football space now. And it was mainly a point that I was making. And the reason I made this point is because we were having a conversation at the end of someone's message. There was a mention of, we need to solve these problems for our African-American friends. Very innocent, doesn't feel controversial kind of comment at all. But I felt it was important to point out to that person, no, it's not our African-American friends' problem. This is our problem. And I think that's the number one, I think that's the predominant misconception with a lot of what's going on in society right now, whether it be the racial injustice that we have seen for the 400 years of this country, whether it is the police brutality and the issues of law enforcement, whether it is the protesting and in some certain sad cases, the subsequent looting that has come about after, whether it's all of those things, I think the number one issue is that it gets cast off as, oh, well, that's their problem. I want to hear them figure out some way to fix it, or our leaders only need to do something to address this. No, this is all of us as a collective, as the United States of America, acting more in a united way, to be quite honest, and realizing that these are issues that we have all shared collectively since 1619, when we can first document that slaves were brought to the United States, and technically even beyond that, when our indigenous brothers and sisters lost their lands and were raped and pillaged and given disease. So I think that's the big thing, is that we just have to realize that this is an American issue, and the forces of change can't just come from certain segments of the population. They can't just fall on the leaders, on the presidents and the government officials. They hold a lot of power. Yes, they hold the ability to sign legislation and that kind of thing, and act certain laws and that kind of thing. But it also comes down to the people being able to be active, to use their First Amendment rights to the best of their abilities, the smartest way of their ability. And and that's not just a black thing. It's not just a white thing. It's an everybody thing. And I think the sooner that as a collective we realize that we really are all in this together, I think the better for all parties involved.
Coley, you mentioned your encounter with police in your own personal life, and you, I thought, very eloquently put a thread together on Twitter. And if for those watching this haven't had a chance to check that out, I certainly encourage you to do so. And without going into too much detail, because there's a lot to unpack there, but why was it important for you to get your story out?
That's a really good question, and one I actually am still kind of even asking myself. It happened about 2 weeks ago now. Just real briefly to kind of give some context, I was I made the decision. I'd been deciding actually for a while, for several weeks, and I was very hesitant for one reason I'll get to in a second. But I decided ultimately I wanted to do this, and that was to drive across the country. I live in Chicago right now, so it's not fully across the country, but it's still cross country enough to go from here all the way to the West Coast. And I, drove through, the rest of the Midwest, Iowa, Nebraska, into Colorado and Utah, Nevada, all the way to San Francisco, down the Pacific Coast Highway, back up through the Grand Canyon, and back through the Midwest on the way home. So it was a 2-week adventure, and I really wanted to do it just because there were parts of the country I've been to, but certain places I haven't seen, and especially haven't seen in one continuous way that way. So it was just a personal adventure I wanted to go on. I had the time to do it. I'm bored sitting in the house, so why not, right? My number one concern, however, going into that drive was being stopped by police, quite honestly. And I made that point known to anyone who had known that I was getting ready to do this, because this was me driving by myself. I wasn't driving with anyone else. It was just me. And I was concerned for being in some of the most rural parts of the country, in desolate parts of the country, where it's a few trucks, a couple of other cars on the road. That's about it. I was concerned about what might happen if I was stopped and something went wrong. And sure enough, not even fully 24 hours into my drive, I got pulled over. And, again, won't go into too many details, but let's just say I was pulled over. When the officer came to the window, he said he pulled me over for driving under the speed limit in the passing lane. Mind you, when I passed his car, I was 2 miles an hour under the speed limit. If I was 10 miles an hour under, I get that, maybe, in that lane, but I was literally 2 miles an hour under, and I had slowed down from what I was doing because I saw him. So, but that's what it was. And he says, well, I'm not going to give you a ticket because I see you're from out of state, but I am going to give you a warning. And during that interaction, I was requested to go to the police car itself. I was scared. I can't lie, because here I am on this, major highway, sure, but, not a ton of traffic outside other than myself and the officers who stopped me. Still bright as day. It's about, this time of day when it happened. So bright day, sunshiny day. And still there was this anxiety that I've seen these videos, by this point, what we saw in Kenosha had not happened, but George Floyd certainly had. And I knew in my heart of hearts, I've got to say the right things, do the right, whatever the right things are. You really don't know in these situations, but whatever you think are the right things, you've got to be able to do those in order to walk away and get back home. And so I'm doing everything in my power to make sure that happens. But, I was questioned as to where I was going, why I was going there, who I was staying with, all these things that were not germane to me going 2 miles an hour under the speed limit in the passing lane. If I understand if that was what the entire conversation was about, that's totally fine, but it wasn't. The entire conversation was a fishing expedition to try to see what I was doing wrong, to see if there was something that they could find on me or within my car or what have you. And it's really unfortunate that it took them asking me where I went to college, what I did for a living, for them to actually kind of take me seriously. And even then they didn't want to believe me. One guy says, oh, you're on TV? I've never seen you before. I'm like, well, you probably haven't seen me lately because the sports I covered, nothing's going on, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. But, but it is what it is. Yeah, I'm not lying to you. This is my job. You can look me up, But it's amazing that it took that kind of part of the conversation for them to realize, yeah, this guy, there's nothing here. He's doing what he's saying, just trying to see America. And yeah, look, I understand the pressures that law enforcement are under when it comes to people who are threats. But there was nothing that should have given them insight into me being a threat at that particular moment in time. There just wasn't. And the unfortunate reality is that for people like me, we're not always given the benefit of the doubt in those situations. It is seen as well, you got to be doing something wrong because so many of you are. That's typically the feeling that that as a Black person, period, especially when we see all these videos that continue to hit our timelines, that's what you feel. And yeah, it was a harrowing experience, but it's not an uncommon experience. I mean, in fact, I had a very similar stop to that one just a few years ago. And because I remembered in the moment, I'm like, okay, I remember how this happened, that happened, that happened. I leaned on that experience in order to get me out of this one. Of course, at this point, I can't even count how many times I have been stopped. And in some cases, yeah, I've been stopped for speeding a couple of times. It happens to all of us. But there have been a number of times where I've been stopped for not doing anything wrong as well. And I've lost count of some of those as well. And that's, as I say to a lot of my friends who've been checking in with me the last couple of days, unfortunately, that's what being Black in America is. But the reason I shared it, I just feel like it, for a long time, I didn't really want to. I felt like I had to, but I didn't really want to because it was personal to me. It was something that happened to me. I didn't really feel like the world should know. But I think the reason why it's important for those stories to be told to the world is because in a lot of cases, people don't want to believe. And they also don't want to believe when it's just some guy that they previously had never heard of, George Floyd, or someone like, Jacob Blake. He's a complete stranger. But someone like me, where there are people who can identify, oh, that's the guy that covered the Yankees. Oh, that's the guy that I've seen doing this, and this. And it happened to him. I just think that there's a reason for, when those situations happen to people like me, we have to be able to stand up and say, this is the reality. And so ultimately I felt it was, within me to share that story for that reason.
I think the experience you described brings me to a really important quote I found in your thread. For me and those like me, it's simple. It's about respect. In your mind, what does that respect truly entail?
It's a good question. Just, you're treating me like you treat yourself. I mean, even within that interaction, I asked them how their days were going, and I got no response out of that. When they realized that, I'm coming out of Chicago, and and that's where I live. The one guy did mention something about, oh yeah, I was just there, came in O'Hare. I was like, oh, okay, we can talk about something. And as I try to get the conversation going, because training kicks in was really what happens, and he has to shut me down. Oh no, I can't engage in conversation with this guy this way. No, I can't. This is a subject. I didn't say suspect, but this is a subject. I've got to treat him as I can't treat him as someone who's like me right now. That was what I felt in that interaction, and that's often what I feel in those interactions. And what it comes down to is we're just human beings, man. We're the exact same. Look, again, I understand some of the things that police officers go through on a daily basis. I know police. I've been around police. I have family members who are police. So I get it. But at the end of the day, just treat someone with respect, especially when you first encounter them. And it just feels like too often, of course, we don't always know what happens when some of the videos that we've seen, when people arrive on the scene, we don't know everything that happens in that particular moment, but it feels like there's no respect that's being given if it ultimately leads to somebody being killed for no reason, to somebody being shot in the back for really no reason. It just feels like the respect isn't there. And so that's what I mean when I say just treat people like you want to be treated. It just always goes back to that golden rule. There was another point I was going to make on that, but I lost it. But that's ultimately what I'm getting at there.
Well, if it comes back to you, let us know. Now, I'm going to make the hard transition because we do want to get to a little bit of the Big Ten and college football with you, Coley. How optimistic are you that college football will return without too much of a hiccup? And your thoughts on the Big Ten postponement, perhaps reversal of course to playing at Thanksgiving?
Yeah, I've obviously got to be careful with what I say because we really just don't know a whole lot. It's not lip service. We just don't, because there's so much about the virus that we don't know. There's so much about just what just what it can portend for a lot of the campuses. Obviously, we've seen some bad news at several campuses around the country as students have been coming back. And of course, I'm praying for you all's safety if you guys have to go back. I hope you don't have to go back, but if you do, I'm praying for your safety with that. And so it is concerning, and there is a state of there's a part of me that is a little pessimistic because of some of what we've seen to this point, but there's a lot of optimism, and I think that optimism comes from we've certainly seen the bubbles work, the NBA and the NHL. From an MLB perspective, they had those couple of weeks that were a little hairy early on, but for the most part, it's worked. And so I think if there is a way that you can make sure the players are isolated, which is not going to be easy when campuses are open and they're expected to be in classes and student groups with other students who could be infected, that's the hard part to it. But if there's a way that you can kind of control a little bit of where they go socially and how they interact socially away from football, maybe so. And for me, I'm curious to know what the logistical and safety protocols are for someone like me, because I'm supposed to technically be on the sideline. As I'm starting to see with some of the NFL plans, it seems like sideline reporters will probably be placed in the first rows of the stadiums. In some cases, maybe they will be allowed on the field. We're still kind of figuring some of that out, I think, just as a collective in broadcast. But that's something I'm concerned about as well. I want to know what it's going to look like when I'm when I'm doing my job, and how I can do my job safely. Am I ready to get back to work? Absolutely. I've been ready to get back to work since like March 17th. This has been a long summer of trying to stay active and practice in other ways and trying to pay attention, but at the same time, not trying to get too inundated with this because it can be a burden. But I'm very much ready to get back to work, but I do want to make sure that we're doing it safely. In terms of the Big Ten, I'm hopeful that maybe we'll get going again at Thanksgiving. Again, I think a lot of it just depends on where the country is with this virus by that point in time. But that being said, with everything that has been reported so far about that being a possibility, and with what we do know at this present state, if we can get it going safely, then let's do it. And that could be a great weekend. You're going to have to change the schedule now anyway. So maybe you get a chance to start with your rivalry games like you normally would on Thanksgiving weekend. So we might see Ohio State, Michigan. Of course, certain conferences are allowing a small number of fans. I don't think that the Big Ten necessarily is trying to entertain that. Some schools may, but I think as a collective, I don't think the conference is for right now. But who knows? Maybe by Thanksgiving we've got, won't be at the Big House, we'll be at the Shoe this year, but, maybe the Shoe is, 20% full. I think that could at least give it a little bit of an environment. But again, at the end of the day, it's about safety. It's about making sure we're doing this all right, because, to this point, there's been a lot that has not been done right as a whole.
That's Coley Harvey. Coley, really appreciate a few minutes. Be well, and thanks so much for coming on.
You guys are awesome. Anytime. Appreciate the opportunity.